In the winter of 1943, as Allied bombers began their systematic destruction of German cities and the Eastern Front stretched across thousands of kilometers of contested territory, Adolf Hitler faced a logistical and security challenge: how to move safely across his crumbling empire. Rail travel, once the preferred method for Nazi leadership, had become vulnerable to partisan attacks and aerial bombardment. Road convoys were slow and exposed. The solution lay in the air, specifically in a modified four-engine Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor, a long-range airliner converted into a flying command post and personal transport for the dictator of the Third Reich. This aircraft, designated Immelmann III and bearing the civil registration D-2600, was no ordinary airplane. It was a symbol of technological prowess, a mobile fortress equipped with armor plating, escape mechanisms, and luxurious furnishings that reflected both Hitler's status and his growing paranoia. For the man who commanded millions but trusted few, the Condor represented a carefully controlled environment, a space where he could travel between headquarters, frontline command posts, and diplomatic meetings while minimizing exposure to enemy action and potential assassination. The story of Hitler's Condor is also the story of Hans Bauer, the Führer's personal pilot and head of the Fliegerstaffel des Führers, the Führer's flight squadron. Bauer, a World War I veteran and skilled aviator, would spend years managing Hitler's aerial movements, testing escape systems, coordinating with Luftwaffe fighters for escort, and navigating the increasingly dangerous skies over wartime Europe. His memoirs, published after the war, provide much of what we know about Hitler's aviation experiences. Though, like all post-war accounts, they must be read with caution, as memory, self-justification, and the passage of time color such narratives. Yet the Condor's story extends beyond verified facts into the realm of legend and propaganda. Tales of narrow escapes, Soviet tanks approaching airfields, bombs smuggled aboard disguised as cognac, last-second takeoffs under fire circulate in documentaries, popular histories, and online videos. Some of these stories have archival support, others are ambiguous, conflated, or possibly apocryphal. Distinguishing between documented incidents and post-war myth-making is one of the challenges facing historians who study Hitler's travels. This documentary narrative explores Hitler's use of the FW-200 Condor, from its conversion and deployment through its destruction in 1944. Examining the aircraft's technical specifications, the dangerous missions it flew, the close calls that may or may not have occurred, and the mythology that grew around these flights. It is a story of engineering, logistics, paranoia, and the thin line between historical fact and legend. The Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor was originally designed in the mid-1930s as a long-range commercial airliner for Deutsche Lufthansa, Germany's national airline. It was a cutting-edge aircraft for its time, a four-engine low-wing monoplane capable of carrying 26 passengers over ranges exceeding 3,000 kilometers. The Condor set several long-distance records in the late 1930s, including a Berlin to New York flight in 1938 that captured international attention and demonstrated German aeronautical engineering prowess. When war began in 1939, the Luftwaffe recognized the Condor's potential for long-range maritime reconnaissance and anti-shipping operations. Production shifted toward military variants equipped with bombs, defensive armament, and extended fuel tanks. These maritime Condors, operating from bases in France and Norway, would become infamous as the scourge of the Atlantic, attacking Allied convoys and coordinating with U-boats. Winston Churchill himself reportedly called the Condor one of the greatest threats to Britain's Atlantic supply lines in 1940-41. But parallel to the military conversion, A handful of Condors were reserved for VIP transport. Hitler's personal aircraft, the Immelmann III, was derived from the FW-200V3 prototype, an early production model selected for conversion into a secure, long-range command transport. The aircraft was named in honor of Max Immelmann, a celebrated German fighter ace from World War I, continuing a tradition of naming Hitler's aircraft after fallen heroes. Earlier transports had included the Richthofen and Immelmann during the Second, based on different aircraft types. The conversion of the Condor V3 into the Immelmann III involved extensive modifications overseen by Focke-Wulf engineers, Luftwaffe technical staff, and Hitler's own security apparatus. The goal was to create an aircraft that balanced long-range capability, defensive protection, and the comfort befitting a head of state, while incorporating mechanisms that would allow Hitler to survive catastrophic scenarios. Interior layout and furnishings. The passenger cabin was reconfigured from its airliner origins into a luxurious flying office. Standard airline seats were removed and replaced with heavy, upholstered furniture, including a large padded seat for Hitler, reportedly with adjustable armrests and a reclining back. A conference table, sleeping berths, and space for adjutants and security personnel. The interior was paneled with wood veneer and fitted with curtains, reading lamps, and communication equipment. Unlike the Spartan conditions of military transports, the Immelmann III resembled a mobile headquarters or a luxury railway car translated into the air. Armored protection. Given Hitler's acute awareness of assassination threats and aerial interception risks, the Condor incorporated armor plating around critical areas. Hitler's personal seat was fitted with a steel-backed frame designed to protect against small arms fire and shrapnel from anti-aircraft bursts. The cockpit was similarly reinforced, with armored glass panels installed to protect the flight crew, while the armor added significant weight, reducing range and speed. It provided psychological reassurance and practical protection against opportunistic attacks or ground fire during takeoffs and landings at forward airfields. The escape hatch and parachute system. Perhaps the most unusual modification was the integrated escape mechanism. Hitler's seat was equipped with a built-in parachute, essentially a parachute pack integrated into the seat cushion or backrest. And directly beneath the seat was a specially designed hatch in the fuselage floor. In theory, if the aircraft was crippled and descending toward a crash, Hitler could pull a lever, the hatch would blow open, and he could drop through the floor and deploy the parachute. Hans Bauer's memoirs describe the testing of this system in considerable detail. According to Bauer, engineers conducted trials using weighted dummies dropped through the hatch at various altitudes and airspeeds to ensure the mechanism functioned correctly and that the parachutist would clear the aircraft's tail and slipstream. The hatch was designed to open against the airflow, a significant engineering challenge as pressurization and aerodynamic forces could jam such an opening. Bauer recounts that successful tests were eventually achieved, though he expressed skepticism about whether Hitler, who was not trained in parachute use and would likely be disoriented or injured in an emergency, could actually execute such an escape. The escape hatch and seat parachute were as much psychological props as practical safety features. Hitler, who had no piloting experience and was reportedly anxious during turbulent flights, likely drew comfort from knowing an escape route existed, however theoretical. For Bauer and his crew, the system represented another layer of responsibility: maintaining and testing a mechanism that, if it failed, could cost the Führer his life. The Immelmann III was also outfitted with state-of-the-art communications equipment for its era. Radio systems allowed Hitler to remain in contact with military headquarters, receive situation reports, and issue orders while in flight. Navigation equipment included advanced radio direction finders and instruments that allowed the crew to fly in adverse weather. A critical capability given the unpredictability of European weather and the need to operate under radio silence to avoid Allied interception and direction finding. The aircraft's range, approximately 3,500 kilometers with reserve fuel, allowed Hitler to fly from Berlin to the occupied territories of the East, Ukraine, the Crimea, or to the West, France, the Low Countries, without refueling, though longer missions often included stops at secure Luftwaffe bases. Hans Bauer was born in 1897 and served as a pilot in World War I, flying reconnaissance missions for the Imperial German Army Air Service. After the war, he transitioned to civilian aviation, eventually joining Deutsche Lufthansa as a commercial pilot. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Bauer flew charter and VIP flights, which brought him into contact with rising political figures, including Adolf Hitler. Hitler, then leader of the Nazi Party and Chancellor of Germany after 1933, recognized the value of air transport for political campaigning and governance. Bauer became Hitler's personal pilot in 1933, a position he would hold until the final days of the Third Reich in 1945. Over those 12 years, Bauer flew Hitler on hundreds of missions, developing an intimate working relationship with the dictator. Hitler, who was not naturally comfortable in the air, he disliked turbulence and reportedly clutched his seat during rough weather, came to trust Bauer implicitly. Bauer was not merely a pilot, but the head of the Fliegerstaffel des Führer, a small air squadron dedicated to Hitler's transport needs. The squadron included multiple aircraft, several Condors, including backups and variants, Junkers Ju-52 tri-motors for shorter hops, and later a Junkers Ju-290 for ultra-long-range missions. Bauer coordinated with the Luftwaffe for fighter escorts, liaised with ground security to secure airfields, and oversaw maintenance crews who kept the aircraft in operational condition. The Fliegerstaffel operated from Berlin-Tempelhof, the capital's central airport, which served as the primary base for Hitler's air operations. Tempelhof was a Luftwaffe-controlled facility with high security, maintenance hangars, and direct access to the Reich Chancellery by motorcade. Secondary bases included airfields near Hitler's other headquarters, the Berghof in Bavaria, the Wolfslair, Wolfschanze in East Prussia, and Vinitsa in occupied Ukraine. Flying Hitler required meticulous planning. Each mission involved route planning. Bauer and his navigators plotted courses that avoided known concentrations of Allied fighters, heavy anti-aircraft defenses, and active combat zones. As the war progressed and Allied air superiority increased, finding safe corridors became increasingly difficult. Flights were often conducted at night or in poor weather to reduce the risk of interception. Fighter escort. High-value flights were escorted by Luftwaffe fighters, typically Messerschmitt Bf-109s or Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, tasked with intercepting any Allied aircraft that approached the Condor. However, fighter escorts were not always available, especially after 1943, when the Luftwaffe was stretched thin defending Germany's cities and industrial centers. Security protocols. Airfields where Hitler would land were secured in advance by SS and Wehrmacht security detachments. The Condor's exact flight path and landing time were closely guarded secrets. Even senior officers were often informed only hours before Hitler's arrival to minimize the risk of assassination or Allied interdiction. Crew and passengers. Besides Bauer and his co-pilot, the Condor typically carried a flight engineer, a radio operator, and several SS bodyguards. Hitler was usually accompanied by one or two adjutants and occasionally by senior military or political figures. The crew was handpicked for loyalty and competence. Bauer personally vouched for each member, After the war, Bauer spent years in Soviet captivity. He was captured in the ruins of Berlin in May 1945, before being released in the 1950s. He subsequently published his memoirs, which provide the most detailed first-hand account of Hitler's air travels. Bauer's recollections include technical descriptions of the Condor, anecdotes about Hitler's behavior in flight, and accounts of dangerous missions and close calls. However, historians treat Bauer's memoirs with caution. Like many post-war accounts by Nazi officials, they are shaped by self-justification, selective memory, and the author's desire to portray himself in a sympathetic light. Bauer emphasizes his professionalism, his loyalty to Hitler, while distancing himself from Nazi ideology, and his role as a protector and servant rather than a war criminal. Dramatic episodes in his memoirs, such as narrow escapes from Soviet forces or emergency landings under fire, are difficult to verify independently, as flight logs and operational records from the Fliegerstaffel were largely destroyed in the war's final months. Nonetheless, Bauer's memoirs remain a valuable source, especially for technical details about the Condor's design and operation. Cross-referencing his account with surviving Luftwaffe records, Allied intelligence reports, and testimony from other crew members allows historians to assess the reliability of specific claims. Hitler's leadership style became increasingly centralized and micromanaging as the war progressed. By 1942-43, he was personally directing military operations at the divisional level, issuing detailed orders about defensive positions, counterattacks, and troop movements. This approach required situational awareness that could not always be conveyed by maps, reports, and radio communications. Consequently, Hitler occasionally traveled to forward command posts to meet with field commanders, assess conditions firsthand, and boost morale among frontline troops. These visits were rare and dangerous. The Eastern Front, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, was a fluid and unpredictable battle space. Luftwaffe control of the skies was contested. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft batteries posed real threats. Ground conditions at forward airfields were often poor. Hastily cleared fields, minimal facilities, and proximity to active combat zones. Yet Hitler's insistence on personal involvement compelled Bauer and the Fliegerstaffel to undertake missions that military aviators considered high risk. Flight to Poltava, Ukraine, summer 1942. One of the better documented front visits occurred during the summer of 1942 at the height of Operation Blue, the Wehrmacht's offensive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. Hitler flew to Poltava, a city in central Ukraine that served as a temporary forward headquarters for Army Group South. The flight, conducted in daylight with fighter escort, passed over recently captured Soviet territory. Bauer's memoirs describe the tension among the crew as they flew within range of Soviet airfields, though no interception occurred. At Poltava, Hitler met with senior commanders, including Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, and reviewed operational plans. The visit was brief. Hitler spent less than 24 hours on the ground before returning to Germany. Security was intensive. The airfield was ringed by anti-aircraft guns and patrolled by Wehrmacht and SS units. Despite the precautions, the visit demonstrated the risks inherent in flying so close to active combat zones. Zaporozhye, February 1943. A more dramatic and controversial visit occurred in February 1943, shortly after the Stalingrad disaster. Hitler flew to Zaporozhye, a city on the Dnieper River in southern Ukraine, to meet with Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and discuss the deteriorating situation on the southern front. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly after their victory at Stalingrad, threatening to encircle German armies in the Donbas region. The Zaporozhye flight has become the subject of considerable legend. According to some accounts, repeated in documentaries and popular histories, Soviet armored units were approaching the airfield even as Hitler landed, and the Condor took off under fire as Soviet tanks closed in. Bauer's memoirs describe a tense situation, with Soviet forces nearby and German commanders urging Hitler to evacuate quickly. But he does not explicitly describe tanks on the airfield or the aircraft taking off under direct fire. More skeptical historians note that while Soviet forces were indeed advancing toward Zaporozhye in February 1943, the specific claim that tanks reached the airfield during Hitler's visit lacks corroboration in Soviet operational records or German frontline reports. It is possible that the proximity of Soviet forces created a sense of urgency. Manstein certainly warned Hitler that the situation was critical. But the dramatic image of the Condor racing down the runway with Soviet tanks in view may be an embellishment that grew in the retelling. What is documented is that Hitler's visit to Zaporozhye was brief and that he was visibly shaken by the deteriorating frontline conditions. Manstein reportedly pressed him to authorize a strategic withdrawal, which Hitler initially resisted, but later partially accepted. The flight back to Germany was conducted under heavy fighter escort, and Bauer later recounted that the crew was relieved to leave Ukrainian airspace. Vinnytsia and the Werewolf headquarters, 1942-43. Hitler spent considerable time at his forward headquarters near Vinnytsia in Ukraine, codenamed Werewolf, during the WWII summer and fall of 1942. Flights to and from Vinnytsia were routine during this period, though they became increasingly hazardous as Soviet air activity increased. Werewolf was equipped with a dedicated airstrip, and the Condor made regular trips ferrying Hitler, staff, and supplies between Berlin, the Berghof, and Vinnytsia. These flights, while less dramatic than the Zaporozhye incident, illustrate the logistical complexity of maintaining aerial mobility for a head of state operating hundreds of kilometers from the capital. Bauer coordinated with local Luftwaffe units to ensure clear skies, arranged for fuel deliveries to Vinnytsia, and maintained a backup aircraft in case of mechanical failure or emergency. Flying Hitler to forward areas exposed the Condor and its escorts to several dangers. Soviet fighters, Soviet aviation, though battered in 1941, had reorganized by 1942-43 and fielded increasingly capable fighters. Yak-9s, LA-5s, and later models posed a genuine threat to the unescorted or lightly armed Condor. Bauer relied on fighter escorts, radio silence, and evasive routing to minimize interception risks. Anti-aircraft fire. German airfields near the front were within range of Soviet artillery and mobile anti-aircraft units. Landings and takeoffs, when the Condor was slow and vulnerable, were conducted quickly, often with minimal ground time. Weather. The Eastern European climate, with its sudden storms, fog, and icing conditions, posed navigational challenges. Bauer and his crew flew instrument approaches in marginal weather, relying on radio beacons and dead reckoning when visibility was poor. Partisan activity. Soviet partisans operating behind German lines occasionally attacked airfields, though there is no documented instance of a direct attack on an airfield while Hitler was present. Nonetheless, the threat required constant vigilance and reinforced security. Despite these dangers, Hitler's front visits between 1941 and 1943 occurred without catastrophic incident, a testament to Bauer's skill, Luftwaffe support, and the operational security maintained by German forces. The story of Hitler's Condor has accumulated layers of myth and speculation, particularly regarding assassination attempts, near misses, and dramatic escapes. Some of these stories have roots in documented events. Others are ambiguous, conflated, or possibly apocryphal. This section examines several prominent claims and assesses their credibility. As discussed in Part 3, The Zaporozhye visit in February 1943 is often portrayed as a narrow escape, with Soviet tanks allegedly approaching the airfield as Hitler's Condor took off. Let us examine this claim more closely. What Bauer's memoirs say. Bauer describes a tense atmosphere at Zaporozhye, with Manstein warning Hitler that Soviet forces were advancing and that the airfield could come under threat. Bauer recounts being urged to prepare for immediate departure and conducting a rapid takeoff with minimal ground time. However, Bauer does not explicitly state that Soviet tanks were visible from the airfield or that the Condor was under fire during takeoff. Soviet operational records. Post-Cold War access to Soviet archives has allowed historians to cross-check German accounts with Soviet operational reports. In February 1943, Soviet forces, particularly mobile units from southwestern and southern fronts, were indeed advancing toward Zaporozhye. But Soviet records do not indicate that armored units reached the airfield on the specific day of Hitler's visit, believed to be 17 to 19 February. The closest documented Soviet penetration occurred several days later, after Hitler had departed. Possible conflation. It is possible that accounts of the Zaporozhye visit have been conflated with other incidents or exaggerated in post-war retellings. Manstein's memoirs, also written after the war, describe the strategic situation as critical but do not mention tanks at the airfield. The image of Soviet tanks closing in on Hitler's aircraft may be a dramatic embellishment that conveys the urgency of the situation, but lacks literal accuracy. Verdict: the Zaporozhye visit was undoubtedly risky, and Soviet forces were nearby. But the specific claim that tanks approached the airfield during Hitler's presence remains unverified and possibly exaggerated. Another persistent story involves an alleged assassination attempt in which a bomb was smuggled aboard the Condor disguised as a case of cognac. According to this account, conspirators within the Wehrmacht, possibly linked to later July 1944 plotters, placed the bomb aboard the aircraft during a stopover, intending to kill Hitler in flight. The bomb allegedly failed to detonate due to a faulty fuse or temperature-related malfunction, and the plot went undiscovered. Origins of the story. Variations of this story appear in post-war accounts and popular histories, but it is not mentioned in Bauer's memoirs or in the extensive documentation of anti-Hitler resistance compiled after the war. The July 1944 assassination attempt, the Stauffenberg plot, is exhaustively documented, and several earlier attempts, such as the Elsair bomb in 1939, are well known. However, no credible archival evidence supports a cognac bomb plot targeting the Condor. Possible confusion. Some historians speculate that this story may be a conflation or misremembering of other assassination plots. There were indeed conspiracies within the Wehrmacht officer corps from 1942 onward, and several involved explosives. It is conceivable that such a plot was discussed or planned, but never executed, and post-war storytelling transformed a planned attempt into a near miss. Verdict: the cognac bomb story should be treated as speculative or apocryphal unless additional evidence emerges. It may reflect the general atmosphere of conspiracy and mistrust within the Nazi regime, but lacks substantiation. More credible are accounts of mechanical issues and forced landings. The Condor, despite its advanced design, was a complex aircraft operating in wartime conditions with stretched maintenance and supply chains. Bauer's memoirs describe several incidents. Engine failures. The Condor's 4 BMW 132 radial engines, while reliable, occasionally suffered malfunctions, particularly in extreme cold on the Eastern Front. Bauer recounts at least one instance of a partial engine failure during a flight over occupied Poland, requiring him to divert to an alternate airfield. Hitler, reportedly anxious during the incident, remained in his seat while Bauer nursed the aircraft to a safe landing. Weather diversions. Fog, storms, and icing forced several diversions to alternate airfields. Bauer describes flying on instruments through overcast skies and making unplanned landings at forward bases when weather closed in on the intended destination. These incidents, while not life-threatening, underscore the unpredictability and stress of wartime aviation. Flak damage, possible. Some accounts suggest that the Condor sustained minor flak damage during flights near the front, though this is not definitively confirmed in Bauer's memoirs or surviving records. If such incidents occurred, they likely involved proximity bursts that caused minor structural damage without threatening the aircraft's integrity. The Allies were certainly aware of Hitler's use of the Condor and discussed the possibility of intercepting or attacking it. British and American intelligence tracked Luftwaffe radio traffic and occasionally detected indications of high-level VIP flights. Fighter pilots were briefed to report unusual Condor sightings, and there were standing orders to engage if an opportunity arose. However, no documented Allied interception of Hitler's Condor occurred. The combination of fighter escort, radio silence, variable routing, and the sheer size of the operational area made interception unlikely. Moreover, Hitler's flights to the front became less frequent after 1943, reducing opportunities for Allied action. There were also ethical and strategic debates within Allied command about assassination. While some argued that killing Hitler would decapitate Nazi leadership, others feared that his death might allow more competent military leaders to take control or create a myth of martyrdom that would stiffen German resistance. These debates, documented in Allied strategic discussions, suggest that even if an opportunity arose, political considerations might have constrained action. Despite the extensive engineering that went into the escape hatch and seat parachute, there is no record of Hitler ever having to use it. The system remained a theoretical safeguard, tested with dummies, but never employed in an actual emergency. Bauer's confidence in his piloting and the Condor's reliability likely meant that catastrophic failures requiring such drastic measures never materialized. The Immelmann III met its end not in aerial combat or on a frontline airfield, but in a bombing raid on Berlin. On 18th of July 1944, Allied bombers struck Tempelhof Airport as part of the ongoing strategic bombing campaign against German infrastructure. The Condor, parked in its hangar, was destroyed by direct hits from high-explosive and incendiary bombs. The aircraft was gutted by fire, and the airframe was damaged beyond repair. By mid-1944, Hitler's movements had already become more restricted. The failure of the Kursk offensive in 1943, the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, and the Soviet summer offensives had shrunk the territory under German control and made long-range flights increasingly dangerous. Hitler spent most of his time in fortified headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, and later the Reich Chancellery Bunker in Berlin. The loss of the Condor, while symbolically significant, had limited practical impact on Hitler's mobility, as he was no longer making the kind of long-distance flights that had characterized 1941 to 43. Before the Condor's destruction, the Fliegerstaffel had already begun transitioning to an even larger and longer-range aircraft. The Junkers Ju-290, a four-engine heavy transport derived from the Ju-90 airliner. The Ju-290 offered greater range, up to 6,000 kilometers, increased payload, and more defensive armament than the Condor. At least one Ju-290 was configured as a VIP transport for Hitler, with similar modifications: armored cockpit, luxury interior, and advanced communications. However, Hitler made limited use of the Ju-290. By late 1944, Allied air superiority over Germany was total. Luftwaffe fighters could no longer guarantee safe passage, and the territory remaining under Nazi control had shrunk to the point where long-range flights were rarely necessary. Hitler's final flights, in late 1944 and early 1945, were short hops between Berlin and the Wolf's Lair, conducted in Junkers Ju-52 tri-motors or Fieseler-Storch liaison aircraft, smaller, slower, but more expendable planes. Hans Bauer remained with Hitler until the final days in the Berlin bunker in April 1945. With no functional aircraft remaining and Berlin surrounded by Soviet forces, Bauer's role as pilot had ended. He was captured by Soviet troops on 2 May 1945 and spent the next decade in Soviet prisons and labor camps before being released in the 1950s. The Fliegerstaffel's other aircraft were destroyed, captured, or abandoned in the war's chaotic final months. The era of Hitler's aerial mobility, symbolized by the Condor, ended with the regime it served. What can be stated with confidence about Hitler's use of the Condor? First, the aircraft itself was real and extensively documented. The Immelmann III was a modified FW-200 Condor equipped with armor, luxury furnishings, and an integrated escape system. Technical records, photographs, and Bauer's detailed descriptions confirm its existence and specifications. Second, Hitler did use the Condor for strategic travel during the war's middle years, 1941-43. He flew to forward headquarters in the east, visited occupied territories in the west, and traveled between his various command posts. These flights were operationally significant, allowing Hitler to exercise direct command over far-flung forces. Third, the flights were dangerous and required careful planning. The risks from Soviet fighters, anti-aircraft fire, weather, and mechanical failure were real, and Bauer and his crew navigated these hazards with skill. Fourth, the Condor was destroyed in a bombing raid in July 1944, and Hitler's subsequent air travel was limited. Beyond these documented facts lies a zone of ambiguity, exaggeration, and myth. The stories of Soviet tanks at Zaporozhye, the Cognac bomb, and other dramatic near misses are difficult to verify. They may contain kernels of truth, moments of heightened danger, close calls that were real but less dramatic than later retellings suggest. Or they may be post-war inventions designed to heighten the narrative tension and underscore Hitler's supposed charmed survival. Several factors contribute to this mythology. Post-war memoirs. Bauer's memoirs, like those of other Nazi officials, were written with hindsight and shaped by the desire to emphasize the author's importance and the drama of his experiences. Dramatic episodes make for compelling reading and may have been embellished consciously or unconsciously. Propaganda. Both Nazi propaganda, which sought to portray Hitler as invincible and fate-protected, and Allied propaganda, which emphasized the threat Hitler posed, contributed to an image of the Führer as a figure who narrowly escaped death repeatedly. These narratives persisted into the post-war period. Popular culture, documentaries, films, and popular histories have amplified and sometimes distorted the historical record, favoring dramatic interpretations over cautious scholarship. The image of Hitler's Condor racing down a runway with enemy tanks approaching is cinematically compelling, even if archival evidence does not fully support it. Archival gaps. The destruction of records in the war's final months means that many details of Hitler's flights cannot be verified or refuted conclusively. In the absence of definitive evidence, speculation fills the void. For historians, the challenge is to distinguish between documented fact, plausible interpretation, and unsupported legend. The Condor's story contains all three. It is a documented aircraft with verified flights and real dangers. It is also a canvas onto which post-war storytellers have projected dramatic narratives that may or may not reflect reality. The story of Hitler's Condor ultimately illustrates a broader truth about historical memory. That dramatic events attract embellishment, that participants' accounts are shaped by their agendas, and that the passage of time blurs the line between what happened and what people believe happened. The Immelmann The-30 was a remarkable aircraft that served a monstrous regime in dangerous times. But separating the engineering marvel and operational reality from the mythology requires careful, skeptical scholarship. Hitler's flights ended as his regime collapsed. The Condor consumed by fire in the same city where it had once taken off, carrying the dictator to the heights of his power. What remains is a complex legacy. Part technical achievement, part propaganda, part legend. A story that reminds us to approach even well-known historical episodes with caution and critical scrutiny.